She is. Okay, so you are in, I'm Ryan, I'm your moderator for today. More importantly, here is your speaker, Shereen Hughes. Oh, goodness. So gonna, you all know the drill at this point here. This is a hybrid session, so we do have some folks online. Hello to our folks online. You can be active in the chat and I will convey things. I don't know why I'm looking at that. They can't look at me. I should be looking at you. But yeah, so you know the drill. I'll be passing out these evaluation forms. Please do fill these out. It's super helpful for us in planning future events and super helpful for our speakers. We always want feedback. That's how we grow. And then of course you get the raffle ticket if you fill it out. So, okay, without further ado, Shereen Hughes. She is the Virginia coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional, CBLP, program and assistant director for Wetlands Watch, a Virginia-based nonprofit focused on the protection, restoration, and resilience of wetlands and communities, promoting climate adaptation through natural and nature-based policies, planning, and actions at the local level. Give it up for Shereen. Cool.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up after lunch and on a beautiful day. And I will try and stay on time. It's really a joy for me to be here. I normally talk about the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program, and I don't really talk about Wetlands Watch that much, but this is one of my pride and joys. It's kind of my baby. I started envisioning it with my my director, almost as soon as I started working at Wetlands Watch. So happy to share it with you. So the Collaboratory is resilience research and design, and it's the goal is to create an adaptive research and design collaborative. So laboratory and collaborative, we got Collaboratory. Why does Wetlands Watch do it? Well, we're in tidal Norfolk, Hampton Roads area, and we have sea level rise to worry about. With sea level rise, when we first started looking at it, we were like, oh my gosh, if everybody puts these hardened shorelines in, we're going to lose our tidal wetlands. They can drown in place if there's no place for them to migrate inland. So we started looking at, well, how can we keep the shoreline free of the hardscapes? Now, they don't do bulkheads as much anymore. Now they do more of a riprap revetment kind of thing. But if the elevation behind the wetlands and the elevation of the slope that goes from the wetlands inland isn't just right, then we'll have wetlands drowning in place. When we first started looking at it in 2007, we were concerned with 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100 and losing 50 to 80% of our tidal wetlands. That has been sped up now. We're now concerned about losing 50% of our tidal wetlands at 2060 and 2.7 feet of sea level rise. So, and that's the worst case scenario. So what we decided to do was start looking at how can we convince people to do things a little differently. And we also did some research and we found that, how are people responding to flooding and sea level rise? Well, when after the storm, they're trying to raise their houses, they're mitigating by raising their houses. But even when the houses are raised, the roads are still flooded. And millions of dollars are going into this. People are on waiting lists. We figured some of them were going to be on a waiting list for 80 years before they could get their houses raised. A lot of the money's going to the more affluent neighborhoods. And so we saw that as problematic, and we don't have the money to raise all the roads. So how can we start thinking about, well, what can we do in that space where people are going to be moving away? And how can we encourage change?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Oh, that was me. I'm sorry.
What do you do?
No, it's just. Oh.
Well, Steve and Cassandra.
I'm tired.
I'm really happy to see you here. That's okay.
Okay.
There we go. Now, this isn't possible either. Although Norfolk is doing some of this, but this is not possible. So traditional mitigation and protections aren't going to work for everybody everywhere. We're going to have to protect some areas, but we're going to have to move away from other areas. So what can we do? We need some tools, and we really want to promote nature-based solutions, because by doing that, we give room for wetlands to grow, we protect wetlands, but we also can protect people as well. So, but at this time, when we started this, a lot of people didn't believe that the natural and nature-based solutions to adaptation and resilience were even feasible in our area. So we developed a climate adaptation agenda or approach. And as we started looking at this, we said, okay, we've got to look at the science, what's happening with mapping and modeling assessments. We need to look at what we can do about it, what is feasible, who has the authority, the planning authority, the programmatic authority, what are the funding mechanisms, how do we explain all these issues to people and policymakers, and how can we generate public and political support for change? Because this is a change in attitudes, it's a change in behaviors among local governments, but also citizens. And what we found was, we did some research about adaptation planning. That was kind of our first foray. And we found that what's happening at the local government level and in the researchers level is they're producing all these different tools, but they're not really involving the public. They just kind of drop them down on the public. So, hey, we've got all these great ideas here. And they just go on a shelf. They weren't getting done. And most people don't know how to interpret a lot of those studies. And so, and local government staff are more interested in dealing with flooding and the total maximum daily load, meeting the water quality goals of the Chesapeake Bay. So how can we work with local governments? How can we support them to encourage them to start thinking about climate adaptation and solutions outside their wheelhouse and outside their comfort zone? When we looked into adaptation planning, this was a really great resource. They did a whole bunch of adaptation planning out in California. At the time we were looking into this, we were also looking at North Carolina, who the state had developed an adaptation plan for climate change and sea level rise. It was, and they put it out there, and they saw all this pushback from the real estate market and the developers. Like, no, we're not moving away from the ocean front, forget it. We're going to keep, you know, adapting that area to protect our ocean front, because that's where all our money. So, and one of the problems we and researchers were fearful that somebody would step on their toes and stop the whole process. But what we all need to understand is, if you don't engage the naysayers and the people that, you know, are concerned, they're going to come back after you've gone through this whole process and developed your plan, and now you're getting ready to implement the actions, and all of a sudden everybody's saying, real estate agents or whoever is saying, no, you're not doing this, forget it. And all that money and time was wasted, and we're back to ground zero. So how do we engage people in the planning process and ask for their input in the first place? So one of the first things we did were these listening sessions in Virginia Beach, where the Institute for Environmental Negotiations worked with us and facilitated it, and we planned it with local governments. And people were showing up and they're saying, yeah, we notice things are changing. We're not afraid to say that. Whereas the local governments in Virginia Beach are saying, no, we're not saying things are changing, because then people will flee. They won't want to live here. So so one of the things we heard as we were out talking to citizen groups and at the listening sessions is people would say, okay, I believe it, something's going on. What do we do about it? What are our options? And Skipper are like, I don't know, because nobody's ever done it before. So what should we do? It's going to require that we think outside the box of our normal solutions and strategies. We also found that when we listened to people, they had other things that they were more concerned about, things that were impacting their daily life, things that were impacting their property. So we started thinking, well, you know, people don't want to hear protect the wetlands. What they want to hear is protect me, protect my livelihood, protect the economy, protect the health and safety of our citizens. That's what they're most concerned about. And so we realized that we're going to have to pull in people across a lot of different sectors. We're going to have to organize them and align them. And if you guys have been coming to this event for a while, you may have heard about collective impact. It's really trying to align a lot of different groups that are all kind of interested in a final similar outcome, but maybe all trying to do it in a different way. And how can we align those efforts? And actually, Beth and I used this as a model when we developed the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program. We also realized, if you haven't heard about community-based social marketing, we realized that we needed a social marketing campaign. We needed to change people's attitudes, but more than that, it's beyond that. We need to change behavior.
Right.
And then we thought, well, it was just Skip and I. There were two people, Skip Stiles and I was supposed to be part-time. How are we going to do this? You know, we couldn't go out to all the individual property owners. That just didn't make any sense. So we decided, well, we're going to work in this midstream level. Thank you to Casey Wetzel for this, diagram. But who are we going to engage? We're going to engage civic leaders and industry leaders and people. If you change their attitudes and behaviors, they can be empowered to go down to the lower level and work with the individual property owners, or go up to the elected officials and bring about change. So this is kind of where Wetlands Watch evolved and developed all their different programs. We have a sea level rise adaptation guide. We do floodplain management and work with the community rating system, which provides flood insurance reductions for communities that participate in it. And so that's nice. People like that. And the actions are to reduce flooding. So that's good. We developed the work to develop the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program and really promote, you know, the use of green infrastructure, and we do citizen action things. And we changed our motto, basically, our mission statement, because originally it was protecting wetlands. And now we work where land, communities, and water meet to conserve nature in a changing climate. And that really better describes what we do. So we helped establish the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program and run that. And then we had a funder come to us and say, we'd like you to do a design challenge, a design competition. And so that's kind of where I'll show you we've got this idea. So our overarching goal of the Collaboratory was, let's link research and education. And because our emerging professionals are coming out of school, but they're not prepared to even think about how to be a resilient adaptation scientist or professional. So how can we engage the universities in educating the students, giving them experiences? And then how can we engage local governments and communities to be involved in these resilience design challenges? And we had this idea, well, we'll start with the design, and then you kind of work your way through all the different issues that will have to be addressed as you get farther and farther into, you have the conceptual design, but you know, what about the policy? Is there a policy that allows you to implement that conceptual design? How does, you know, how about the people, the quality of life? Is it going to improve the quality of life of people? Can you add these different layers of benefits? And then we just really wanted to foster innovation, because really when the phase 2 watershed implementation plan came out in Hampton Roads, none of the engineers believed that we could use green infrastructure to meet our water quality goals. They didn't trust them. They just wanted to stay with their ponds and their ditches because they need to store water because of the flooding issue. And so we had all these, you know, established professionals that did not believe that these options would work, first of all, for just managing water today, let alone for managing changing water conditions. Oops. We had this solar decathlon as kind of an idea, and we had some university partners that had co-taught a class with engineers and architects to go through and develop these little solar houses, basically. And it was a big national competition, and it fostered innovation. It helped with research. It was a applied learning process for the students, and a lot of different groups were pulled in. And then we had these after the storm competition. So post Sandy, there was all this money that was going to design competitions to develop resilient adaptation designs for areas that were devastated by Hurricane Sandy in the New York area and the coastline. And Far Rock, that's a post-Sandy competition. We really like this whole idea of it's going to be, some people are going to have to do really big things, but really most of the things we're going to have to think about is what are small, affordable, smart interventions, small, affordable, smart change that can be done, distributed throughout the landscape and along our shorelines and through our communities. So what came out of this whole, that's all the background, but the first project, collaboratory project we did, Virginia Sea Grant came to us and they said, we want to fund you to develop a design competition. And we want you to work with universities, and our first partners were Hampton University Architecture Department and Old Dominion University's Environmental Engineering Department, and they had co-taught that decathlon, solar decathlon program. So we did it in 2014. Nobody had ever done it before. It was the first time anybody looked at how can we do this before the storm rather than after the storm. And we had all these partners, we really wanted to raise awareness of this emerging opportunity for professional growth and services in the resilience and adaptation field. And our private sector consultants weren't really there yet, and our public sector workers weren't really there yet, but people came on board. And I would say one of the first things is have your partners set up and find your local champions before you try and do anything like this, because you need those local champions that have trusted relationships with the people, with the communities. You need to have trusted relationships with the public staff, because they're actually putting their jobs on the line sometimes, doing something different. So, so we developed the partnerships, and we put together a steering committee, and we said, okay, what would be a really tough design challenge? Well, oh my gosh, we've got the perfect one. Chesterfield Heights in Norfolk, Virginia. It's a low-income African-American community. It's historic. It's a historic designation. So some of the changes to the structures can't happen because it changes the historic designation of the structures. It's at risk to flooding, but it's not totally at risk to flooding yet. It has some elevation between the ground surface and the water table. It's vibrant and very civically engaged. They have a really strong civic community. And the Elizabeth River Project said, we already have partnerships. We already know the civic leaders in this community and they trust us, and we would love to introduce you. And also the Elizabeth River Project was already doing some really cool projects. They had just done a wetlands restoration project, and they had their learning barge there. And so it was just really looked like a great opportunity. And in our area, this is a flood map. Where the flood zone is now is where we can expect sea level rise with 2 feet of sea level rise. So this is kind of a good way to introduce you all to what people are having to contend with in this community. So there are some places that will stay very high and elevated, but the roads are going to be impassable. And parts of it will be underwater in the future. So these are the historic homes. They all had high porches, so elevated porches. One of the things I will say is we really wanted to have some realistic expectations. Like you have to decide what is the life of this community. We don't all want to hear this, but there is going to need to be a managed retreat away from our low-lying areas. They will be underwater at one of these days. So how can we do this gradually? How can we make it resilient and adaptive until about 2080, for instance? It seemed manageable. And then it's really important that you get to know the community members and ask permission to come into the community. You know, don't just descend on them like the parachutes. So we asked them if they would be willing to meet with us. We had food, we helped with childcare. Another thing to consider and include if you're going into a low-income community is that you might get more people there if you provide them with something besides just saying, I'm going to gift you with this wonderful new design. You know, it's more about building relationships. And then what do they know and what do they need? This is their community. They know what their problems are, current problems, and they have current issues they need addressed. So we really wanted the students to understand that they needed to work with the community. We needed to collect stories and value the history and culture of that community, and then develop strategies that acknowledge that, and value the community needs and concerns, and then fix today's problems, because they already had flooding problems. They have roads that flood, and they can't only have one access out of the neighborhood. They have all kinds of other problems. So fix those problems, but then what are some possible solutions? And then have a plan to change over time, because all of this rising sea levels and rising water levels is incremental. It's slow. You don't really sometimes acknowledge it until all of a sudden you have a flooded streets on a sunny day because there's a high tide and a wind. And all of a sudden areas that used to be above water are underwater pretty regularly. Bring more resources, plan to bring more resources to the community. And we really wanted all the students to maintain and add ecosystem services in their plans. And then at that time, we were planning for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. So this is actually a diagram that Willie Parks, he was an architecture student, came up with the black and blue part of the diagram, and I loved it. It's just really nice. These are mitigation strategies or adaptation strategies. Mitigation is how do you go back and mitigate further flooding, for instance. And then adaptation is how do you change with time. Resilience is how do you make a community able to bounce back from risks and other things that are impacting them. So I added the green, and it's really how can we add, what kinds of green infrastructure can we add to this diagram, to the communities that will make them more resilient. We introduced the students to this kind of planning concept because we felt like they would be really best to gather the information and work with the community. This was an African-American community, and Hampton University is a historic Black college, and most of the students are African-American. So it was a great, so having them walking around the neighborhood and talking to the community members was a much easier transition into this community. And so they identified the problems. We had community meetings, and we had the community members post where they were having problems and issues. And then we brought in private sector researchers, private sector consultants and researchers, and to mentor the students and educate them in the process too. So if the students had questions about what's more resilient, old brick and mortar or new brick and mortar, we had an expert who could come in and talk to them about historic brick buildings and how resilient the old mortar is compared to new mortar. We had geophysicists talk about if you filled in the basements, what would happen to the walls and the structure. So, and then by engaging the private sector, we actually were building their awareness of sea level rise and the issues. So that was kind of bringing the private sector up to speed as well. The students developed and presented a series of adaptation designs and plans. With the architecture students developed some plans at the first half of the year, and then the ODU students came in on a capstone project at the second half of the year, and they took all the architecture students' designs and concepts and modeled them to see what the impacts would be. So it was a really nice combination of pie in the sky ideas versus what could actually work. And they came up with some really interesting things. These are base turns, putting cisterns in the basements because the basements were flooding and you don't want people living in those basements, but you could store water in the basements. And they had green streets and living shorelines. And one of the streets was already bricked. And so they brought that brick back into it and for keeping that historical character, but they added stormwater management into the streetscape. And by doing the modeling and adding these and modeling these practices, they were able to reduce flooding by 90% for a design storm, which was Ernesto. It was a big storm that we had. So they were able to model the impacts that this would have without having the city have to replace all the storm sewer lines. So it could save some money. What happened after that is that we had the Dutch come to Norfolk, and they ran these series of design charrettes called the Dutch Dialogues. And our students were invited to the Dutch Dialogues, the professors. We were invited along with local staff, and we worked side by side with Dutch experts on managing that sea level. And so one of the really cool things was our designs were held up as the way that Norfolk and Hampton Roads needed to think about planning and adapting to sea level rise. It was really an amazing thing. It also created a lot of interest in what could we do? How could, maybe we need to think about this and start funding it. So the students were involved in this. I had one Dutch professional tell an engineer, the engineer said, "This isn't even possible. We can't do this." And the Dutch guy said, "You are wrong." And I was just like, oh, bad. Local staff, I couldn't say that, but the Dutch could say it. It was great. What happened was Virginia decided to go for this post-Sandy HUD grant, and localities were invited to submit to the HUD grant, and the only plan that got funded was Chesterfield Heights, because it met all the needs of a HUD grant. Is how do you make this community more resilient in the future? It kind of blew up, to be honest with you. It went from our kind of very modest, anti-fragile kind of adaptations to huge adaptations, where once you have federal dollars involved, you have to plan for a certain amount of flooding, protection from flooding. There are now, there's a berm that goes all the way around. And they actually included this area, which was a very low income community. They added parkland that manages water, floods, it's allowed to flood. They added wetlands, they added living shorelines. One of the things we found out with this community is the gentleman said, "We want to maintain our water access because this is where we get our protein. We don't have a lot of money. We don't make a lot of money, but we are, have a good life. And it's because we can go into the water and fish and get oysters. And that's what we want to maintain that access." And so there was a pier that was included and this access here so that people could get in this kind of a beach right here. So inspiration led to hiring contractors to refine the students' designs, then led to funding then all this money was poured into finalizing and developing these construction-ready plans. And it engaged all these different contractors. Some of them were local, so it added to the local economy. And several of the contractors actually hired several of the students to be there to employ them. So this one of the architecture students went to WFA, and he also got a fellowship first and then came back to the area. He was going to go into the Corps of Engineers, and he did this instead. And he's still working with that architecture company. And Arcadis, which is a Dutch-owned company, hired our kind of star engineer. And right after the competition, this young guy called me up and said, I have to design parking lots. It's so boring. You know, I said, just be patient. And then Arcadis hired him to advise them as they were developing the plans because he knew the site so well. And he taught himself how to do the modeling because the engineering department didn't even teach modeling. So that was just like, here's these students getting these hands-on skills, applied experience, getting out and learning what you do will impact communities and can have an impact. And then they get jobs. So that's like, people, these young people that are learning all these skills and knowledge, and they're coming back to Hampton Roads and they're bringing that talent with them, and they're rising all the talent in the area up. So, and they won awards, scholarships. It was pretty amazing. The HUD funding also funded this Rise Resilience Center, and they are funding other small startup businesses that are doing innovative resilience adaptation work. So that's like, I mean, all the stars were aligned with that project. Is that our prototype for the Collaboratory? Is that how it's going to go? No, it's not going to go that way. That was kind of amazing. We never had those expectations that all that money would come. And frankly, I worry when so much attention is brought to a community, because it was a lovely community, very close knit, and they've been under construction for 3 years. And then we have a concern of gentrification. Like, is there going to be pressure on them? Are their taxes going to go up? So we've stayed really involved, and that's another lesson to learn is don't just be one of the parachutes that come in and say, you're a project. It's not a project, it's a community full of people, and you're impacting their life for better or for worse, and you shouldn't walk away. So we continue to stay involved, and we've stayed involved all along. We have a person with a law degree who's given them legal advice. So hopefully they'll be okay. But we, from there, we, the Sea Grant, Virginia Sea Grant said, let's form this collaboratory, let's form a partnership, and we're going to work on some more projects. And we've had more funding, more projects every semester, every year. We pick new projects and we run them. So we started with the tidewater resilience design. Then we got a private funder out of Charlottesville who gave us some funding to work with the GIS program with at Virginia Tech and look at social resilience. The city of Hampton also had involvement in the Dutch dialogues, and they developed a resilience plan, living with water, and the students came in and looked at some of the concept plans for living with water and thinking about resilience. Then we worked with the Elizabeth River project, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this one because this is where we started running into some complications. When all of a sudden we had some prescribed outcomes and expectations that weren't realistic necessarily or weren't synced properly. And so we learned a lot of lessons here. But then we have some more work that we did from 2019 to 2022. We call that the Managed Retreat Project, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And right now we're working on what we call community resilience profiles. I'll talk about that. So this is how the Dutch dialogues, here's our 2014-15, then the Dutch dialogues come in, then professional proposals, the HUD grant, and then Ohio Creek project. It's still not complete. It's been, like I said, 3 years. So the next set was the Broad Creek series. It was a NIFWIF grant, and the Elizabeth River project had the idea that we want to replumb our urban ditches. They're all wet. They're wet all the time. They don't flow anymore. So what can we do with those ditches? And then what are some green infrastructure practices that we can implement throughout these neighborhoods? All up the same creek that the next creek over to the Ohio Creek project. And similar circumstances, but these weren't historic districts, but predominantly African-American, low to moderate income, a lot of houses on slab. So they're really starting to experience flooding and destructive flooding. And we had kind of this concept. Well, ERP will pick the neighborhoods, and they wanted to prescribe that the solutions would include these environmental stewardship practices like rain gardens, rain barrels, etc., for the community, because they have a cost share program, and they wanted to promote that cost share program, Riverstar Homes. We had a UVA architecture class and professor, and she was running a seminar class, and she wanted to bring the architecture students in to interact with the community and then come up with conceptual designs. And then our job was to find engineering students and hand them over. And then ERP was going to use the NIFWIF funds to hire contractors, finalize construction details, and implement designs. But here's where we ran into problems in the engineering students part. The expectation was the students are going to produce these construction-ready diagrams. That didn't work. That wasn't even feasible. Not only that, but the engineering students are capstone projects, and they get to choose what their capstone projects are at the beginning of the semester or the beginning of the year. And you won't even know if they decided to choose your project or not. So we ended up, the engineering students at ODU weren't interested in the project, so we couldn't find engineering students for that. We got another UVA green site studio, but they couldn't produce the engineered drawings. And then ERP actually ended up hiring Center for Watershed Protection, and they developed the ditch retrofit drawings, and they were, shovel-ready designs. And then the communities changed their minds several times during the final design process. So one of the things that was an issue was that the UVA architecture students, they weren't all architecture students. It was like an elective seminar, and they came from all different backgrounds, and their understanding of the environmental systems and constraints was very limited. So we didn't always have realistic ideas coming out. We tried to encourage them to make sure they're realistic, but we didn't have enough time to really dig in to what the constraints were on the site. So we had 3 sites. The second one, this was the Poplar Hall. This is where we actually got Virginia Tech students involved and interested, but we had to get them interested the year before the whole project. And so we'd never worked with them before. So we had to develop some trust and relationships to bring these students in. And then we had to trust that the students would actually choose it as a project. So we had to kind of push the professor to push that as a potential project and make it exciting. So unlike the ODU engineering students, these had never done modeling before. There was the idea that they wanted to do modeling. We wanted them to do these treatment trains of these small scale practices. They got all excited about a weir and a pond, and we didn't get anything out of them. But this is the first year that I actually started working with Dr. Min-Tae Kim. He teaches at Virginia Tech, he teaches the Senior Fall Resilience Design Studio. And this is perfect. I mean, this relationship is perfect, and everything, almost everything that comes out of it. Sometimes it's unpredictable, but we get really quality designs. They do modeling. I mean, it's just like they have the skills and the knowledge, and it's their senior year of a 5-year program. So they're mature and they're actually ready to leave and go and get into the marketplace. So we started getting some really great results. But what ended up happening is they were asked to do a park redesign. Well, nobody asked the park if they wanted a redesign, the park systems. They didn't want a redesign. They didn't want any, they don't have enough staff to do any work on these parks, and they didn't want any changes. So then you have students working on something that nobody even wants. How are we doing with fun?
19 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So we just had a lot of lessons learned, and it was frustrating for everybody because our partners' expectations were that they were going to get construction drawings from students that had never done them before. And and then we had to figure out the timing of students' projects, how they select the projects, when they select the projects, whether they'll be involved. Is it the professor that dictates what they'll work on? And for the Min-Tae Kim's class, we give them a site, and we give them some, design goals, but we kind of give them a lot of freedom. And to me, one of the things is, we can't expect the students, it's a learning process for them. That's why they're there. We're giving them some experience, some hands-on experience, so that they'll get out of school with a lot more knowledge and be better professionals. But, they're not free labor, and they're not consultants yet. They haven't had that experience, and we shouldn't have the expectation that you're going to get something that's ready to go. It's going to vary tremendously from student to student, from class to class, but having those relationships with the professors and understanding the system is important. And also that's just their academic year doesn't always line up with your grants either. So that can be somewhat difficult, managing the expectations. And then it's like communities are diverse. I mean, they're full of diverse people. They're all people, all of them have different ideas. Each one is unique. Each community was unique. Even within that watershed, they had similar characteristics, but they had unique issues and unique people and concerns. And so you need to understand that. And then I think it was really, it was either this one or the previous project where people showed up and they said, I'm so glad you have childcare and food. I mean, because I couldn't have come if you hadn't done that. So that was a lesson that, we tried to engage. Once we hit COVID, though, a lot of things changed. You can't bring the students to the community and meet in person. So some of our successes not sure how successful they are in terms of actually getting a funded project eventually and getting implemented. But we're getting some amazing designs that we're stacking up and keeping in reserve and sharing with localities. So this is the final project I'm going to talk about. Well, actually, second to last topic, but we have an expert who got some funding from the American Flood Coalition, Climate Adaptation Fund, Virginia Environmental Endowment, to partner with the Living River Trust. It's a land trust that is affiliated with the Elizabeth River Project, to look at how can we build managed retreat into a community. All those yellow lots are all lots that were repetitively flooded. The city of Chesapeake came in and removed the houses, and now they're vacant lots. And they don't want those lots. They don't want to manage those lots anymore. So, because time and people and have to send people over to mow and stuff like that. So they approached Wetlands Watch and Living River Trust about the idea that maybe we could work with this land and put it into a conservation easement, and the Living River Trust would be responsible for it. So we did a design charrette where the landscape architecture students initially just looked at this area, but the next year I had them come in. I said, look at all that land that's available. They could have stormwater all over the place. You know, they could have parks that absorb water. There's all this opportunity, and maybe we could be smart about it and keep this community resilient for a little longer. But eventually, probably the whole community will be underwater. And so how can you do it incrementally? So that particular year, the students did what will the flooding and sea level rise look like at 2040, 2060, 2080? And what are the options for this community to change over time? And you know, start moving away from the wet areas. And this was really successful in that the city of Chesapeake said, oh, you know what? We really need a community park there. And we never even thought about a passive recreation park that builds flood mitigation but provides this amenity for the community and for the community around. And they just love this one student's design. And they have now hired one of our partners, Stromberg, Garrigan and Associates, to develop a final design for this community park, and they're getting funding. They've, you know, decided to fund install this park for this community. And right now it's just mowed land with some weeds on it. So this to me was really cool, because this actually took another Wetlands Watch project and it added a collaboratory project on top of it. And the outcome were solutions for other communities, but an actual change in this community. So once again, every at-risk neighborhood is unique, and there are many. And you can't do all of them, but if we can come up with some prototype ideas, that's what the collaboratory is there for. Build innovation into our thoughts. Think outside the box, use students, because they're not entrenched in the standard think that they've, you know, from people that are out there working in this area. This is our most recent one. It's off to a messy start. We thought we had all our partners lined up and everybody was communicating. And we've got Hampton University's architecture department. We've got Virginia Tech's landscape architecture department. We've got Christopher Newport sociology department engaged. And we have community members. There's a coalition. It's this historic African-American community designed by a Hampton University architect. And it was designed as a New Deal community to provide agricultural opportunities within the community. So all the lots are deep and big, and there's opportunity for people to use that to grow food and then to share that food or to sell it to each other. And so the part of it that I'm really excited about is the Virginia Tech landscape architecture students are thinking about the youth of this community and providing them with urban agriculture experiences and thinking about how could we bring back that original concept to this community, but also help them to maintain their historic status, to bring improvements to the community, and also address flooding. So we can inspire climate resilience with collaboration. I think we can. But we need to make sure that we're not doing that. You know, we're not just dropping plans on people. And then we need to stick around for the messy parts after the design. It's not just a project, it's community. And we need to make sure that those communities are adapted and resilient, not just from the land and the water management, but socially and whatever else they need to address within their community. There you go. 10 minutes for questions. Any questions? I have other projects. Yeah.
So you mentioned just now, using those lots potentially to grow food and contribute to the local economy. What do you see as being Wetlands Watch role in creating circular economies within small communities that are otherwise food deserts? And how would you factor in this type of project where you're building resiliency?
Well, I actually think that I've been trying to introduce the landscape architecture students to permaculture concepts because it's managing water and you can grow food and, it's environmentally sensitive. The coalition, this Aberdeen Gardens Community Coalition has this stated goal to educate and inform the youth of the community. And so that they already have a lot of initiative behind it, a lot of energy behind that. And if we can give them some ideas on how they could do that, to build it into their education system. They have a public open space right next to a school, and the school is a center for community. And they also have a historic property, so they could build some lots so that you're producing food on it and as a prototype. And then this is an opportunity because there's so much land in the middle of the city. This is a really urban area around it, so it's unique in that way. A lot of times we just have these small lots. Did that answer your question? Our role is really to facilitate communication and to advise. So we're coordinating all the different players, making sure they're aligned, making sure that the students understand what their goals and objectives are, making sure that the community understands what's going on. The other aspect of that program is we've been thinking for years that there's this need for young people to there's an opportunity for people to make a living going around and developing these community flood profiles. And so we have some funding to hire some of the citizens within the community to pay them and then at the same time provide them with skills that they can use and could translate as we move to other communities where we're developing flood profiles. Yeah.
So we've met a few times with Friends of the Rappahannock.
Yeah.
And of course, we do a lot of restoration projects, but it really stuck with me how you're saying to have that presence after the projects.
Yeah.
Did you face a lot of challenges with that, just time-wise? I know it's important, but how hard is it to stay involved in this?
Well, frankly, we didn't have the funding to do it, but we did it anyway. We just committed to it. I think you just really have to understand, sometimes you just have to do it. And I don't live in Norfolk, so I couldn't go to that community and be there, but we have a number of staff and they built relationships with people within the community and they keep those relationships. So they're going to need that Ohio Creek community. They're one of the things that I talked to another partner with is we've talked about actually holding a CDLP cruise training in the community and training the community members on how to manage the BMPs, and then trying to work with the city to have them hire those people to do the maintenance because they're right there, and they can take care of it if they have pride in it and understand what they're doing. So that's another. But you gotta wait till everybody's out of there, all the construction stuff. Anything else? Yeah.
So First of all, great presentation, and
Thank you.
Learn a lot. When you were talking about students finding jobs, kind of building this pipeline of getting students engaged and then connecting with these contractors, was that an unintended consequence? So that was by design?
It was by design because we didn't have a sea level rise adaptation and resilience industry
Mhm.
in when we started. It's growing, and that Ohio Creek project just helped to boost it. And they don't all come back to our area, but like all those Virginia Tech architecture, landscape architecture students, they all got jobs. The city wanted to hire the young woman who did that design. She didn't even answer their emails. She was already employed. So, but I've had other students. There's a young woman, an engineering student with the biosystems engineering at Virginia Tech. They did a really cool design project and she went above and beyond. I mean, she was taking a GIS class and she said, I did this GIS map. I thought you might be interested in it along with the whole project. And she reached out to me and asked for a letter of recommendation for a job in Charlottesville. And I said, absolutely, because you went above and beyond. So we can provide letters of recommendation. We can meet them up, match them up. A lot of local governments don't have enough staff. So they're looking for people all the time. So they're all like, yeah, we'll be involved in this. Sure. We want to get them here. We want to employ them. So that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess my follow-up would be, if that wasn't an unintended consequence, were there unintended consequences in the broader scope of just all of what Wetlands Watch has done with the Collaboratory?
Yeah, one of the things is if our client is a local government staff, they can sometimes deviate off the, intentions, the good intentions that we have to try and do something. And that impacts the community. Like they can run over the community. Like, okay, now we're going to build our reputation on resilience. That's kind of what has happened a bit, was a lot of people built their reputation on the Ohio Creek project with not always so sensitive, but they were pretty good about, they had community meetings regularly and, but there's people trampling through this community all the time. And it was a quiet community. One of the really good things that happened was that community was cut off from Norfolk State, which is also African-American university. And there was a connection, the professors lived in this community. The only way they could get to the other side, they had this highway, huge highway, and they have this big wall. The only way they could get to the other side was this dark tunnel under the road. And they actually came back in. The community said, we want safe passage to the tide, which is it's a subway, not subway, but above ground rail system, light rail. We want safe passage over there and be able to walk over to Norfolk State. And so they really went back and they added safe walkable conditions to this community. They connected the community using bike trails to the downtown area. The whole community was totally disconnected from the rest of the city. And one of the things that this community was, we had some issues with this. They're like, people have been crappy to us. The government's been really crappy to us, and we don't trust that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. So we had to continue to be in the room and help be their, be their advocate.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have one project I just want to tell you guys about. City of Virginia Beach. They have they always give us, they're all Virginia Tech landscape architecture graduates. They give us a project every year, but it's always, I'm always like, yeah, this isn't gonna be that great. Well, one year they gave us this lot that was all wooded. And they said, we want to keep it wooded, but it's going to become a cemetery. It's owned by the Catholic diocese. We want your students come up with an alternative use of this property that keeps the wooded character. And then we'll see if we can do a land swap with the Catholic diocese. And so this, I was like, okay, it's just like 10 acres of woods. What are they gonna do? Oh my gosh, this was during COVID, and the designs that came from those students were so inspiring. One young woman said, I'm gonna make this a memorial garden. And that she came up with this thing where you plant people's bodies under a tree. You plant the tree in the body and plant it, and that's the memorial for the person. And she made this park of trees. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is just amazing, you know? And so that's one of the lessons, is don't put them in too much of a box, because then you don't have those opportunities for inspiring ideas that I never would have thought about, but they're coming at it from a different perspective. And many of them were very hypersensitive because of going through COVID, and they just came up with really amazing ideas. And I just thought it wasn't going to be that interesting. And they catch me by surprise every time. So it's very rewarding, I think, actually. So I think I'm done.
Yeah. All right, I will